Nestled deep in the hills of Malibu, there's a house that sits quietly behind a shroud of eucalyptus and cypress trees. From the road, the property is mostly hidden, a pale stucco villa with a red clay tile roof, a style common to old Hollywood estates. But for those who know, the house once belonged to actor David Janssen, best remembered for The Fugitive. After Janssen's sudden death in 1980, the house exchanged hands a few times, though no owner seemed to stay for long. It wasn't until Peter and Elaine Maddox, a couple in their late 40s, bought the house in early 2016 that the stories began to take a more tangible form. Peter was a semi-retired music producer, burnt out from decades in the industry. Elaine, a former ballet instructor, had been battling an autoimmune disorder and sought the quiet of Malibu's coastal air. When their real estate agent showed them the Janssen property, Elaine was immediately taken by the secluded gardens, the large Spanish-style fireplace, and the almost cinematic feel of the house. They didn't care much about the history of the home. To them, it was just another Hollywood story. Someone famous lived here once, and now they'd get the privacy they craved. They moved in that spring, and within the first month, small things began to unsettle them. The master bedroom, once Janssen's, had a faint smell of cigarette smoke, despite the walls having been repainted multiple times. Elaine, particularly sensitive to scents, would wake at night complaining that someone had been smoking by the bed. Peter laughed it off, blaming it on old wood or leftover residue in the vents. But then came the footsteps. Late at night, after midnight, both Peter and Elaine heard distinct, measured steps coming from the tiled hallway that connected the bedrooms to the study. At first, Peter suspected raccoons on the roof, but the footsteps were too deliberate, too paced, almost like a man walking slowly in contemplation. One night, Elaine got up to use the bathroom and swore she saw a shadow of a man, standing just at the threshold of the study, a broad-shouldered silhouette, unmoving, staring into the dark. She froze, thinking it was Peter, but when she called out his name, the shadow dissolved into the dark. Peter was still in bed. After that, the sightings escalated. Peter himself, a skeptic, witnessed the same form twice. Once reflected in the large mirror by the foyer, the figure of a man in his 50s, hair slicked back, wearing what seemed like a dark robe or smoking jacket, gone in a blink. The couple hired a local medium after speaking to a neighbor who casually mentioned that Janssen never really left the house. The medium, an older woman named Carla, walked the house quietly for an hour before declaring that the man here doesn't know he's gone. She described a presence that was neither malicious nor particularly sad, but restless, stuck in the routines of a life cut too short. She picked up the smell of cigarettes, the low hum of music perhaps from a phonograph, and a man's deep voice speaking to himself, rehearsing lines or arguments. One room became particularly active, the study, where Janssen reportedly spent much of his private time. Books would be found open, despite neither Peter nor Elaine touching them. Drawers occasionally left ajar. Once, a heavy volume on Hollywood history fell off the shelf without explanation, narrowly missing Elaine. Elaine began dreaming of the man, his face vague but familiar, watching her from the hallway, never speaking, always observing. By 2020, the presence became too much for Elaine. Her health had worsened, and though the doctors cited her autoimmune disease, she believed the constant unease in the house drained her. Peter, still skeptical but increasingly disturbed, agreed to sell. The house was quietly listed off-market, eventually sold to a European investor who rarely visited. Since then, maintenance staff have reported the same sensations. Footsteps, doors ajar, the scent of smoke despite a strict no-smoking policy. Some Malibu locals swear that at night, if you walk the stretch of road near the property, you can smell a faint whiff of cigarette smoke if the wind is right. They say it's David Janssen still pacing his study, still rehearsing lines that will never be delivered, still not ready to leave. They left the study door closed most nights. It was a quiet compromise between curiosity and caution. The room had an energy they could never neutralize, no matter how much they aired it out or rearranged the furniture. Elaine once tried to brighten it with fresh flowers, placing a vase of white lilies on the desk. By morning, every petal had wilted, the water in the vase inexplicably clouded. Peter joked that maybe the ghost wasn't fond of flowers, but when it happened again with a second bouquet, the joke landed sour in the air. The room itself was almost claustrophobic despite its generous size. The floor-to-ceiling bookshelves carried the weight of decades of forgotten novels, scripts, and yellowed newspapers. A battered leather chair remained tucked behind the desk, the previous owner having left it behind as part of the sale. The agent had called it vintage, but to Peter it was just used worn where the elbows would rest, a faded indent where someone had sat for years, perhaps nightly. What unnerved Peter was that despite their own furniture shifting elsewhere, they never touched that chair. Neither of them said it aloud, but both felt as though it was claimed, an object that didn't belong to them, no matter whose name was on the deed. On one of those cold May nights, Peter stayed up after Elaine went to bed, nursing a scotch in the living room. He watched the flicker of the flames in the fireplace, the logs hissing quietly as they split and blackened. The house was silent save for the occasional pop of embers. He was beginning to doze off when he heard the footsteps again, slow, heavy, deliberate, pacing down the hall. For the first time, Peter didn't freeze. He stood up, glass still in hand, and crept toward the hallway. The floor beneath his bare feet was cool, and as he reached the corridor's entrance, he paused. The footsteps had stopped, but ahead, just where the hallway turned toward the study, the air looked distorted. A faint shimmer, like heat rising off asphalt, disturbed the shape of the air itself. Peter rubbed his eyes, thinking he was imagining it, but it remained an unsteady ripple, as if the hallway had developed its own atmosphere, dense and separate. He stepped forward, and then the smell hit him thick, unmistakable cigarette smoke, layered and stale, like an old nightclub or the inside of a long-abandoned car. But it wasn't just smell. It was taste, texture. The smoke felt real, pressing into his sinuses, coating his tongue. Then a sound. A voice. Low, gravelly, muttering something unintelligible, like a man rehearsing a line under his breath, repeating it until it sounded natural. Peter strained to hear, but the words were submerged in that murmur, like hearing a conversation through a thick hotel wall. But he caught a phrase. "They're watching me. They're always watching." Peter's stomach turned cold. He stepped back. The ripple vanished, as if sucked back into the floorboards, and the smell dissipated almost instantly. He returned to the living room, heart pounding, finishing his scotch in one heavy gulp. He didn't wake Elaine. For some reason, he knew that whatever he had just encountered was meant for him alone. In the weeks that followed, Peter avoided the study altogether. Elaine noticed but said nothing, though her own discomfort had grown sharper. She'd begun to hear a phonograph playing, but only faintly, as though it were turned down low in another room. She described it as old music, from the 60s or 70s, something jazzy, smoky, elegant. But when she'd walk the halls, trying to find the source, the music would vanish. On a particularly gray morning, Elaine stood by the large window facing the back garden, where the eucalyptus trees swayed, their silver leaves whispering against each other. She could hear the music again, clearer this time, a saxophone crooning softly, the kind of song you'd hear in a dark bar near Last Call. She closed her eyes to listen, savoring the melody despite the unease it brought. But when she opened them, her breath caught. At the far end of the garden, just beyond the rusted gate, stood a man in a dark robe-like coat, his hands tucked in the pockets, staring directly at her. His figure was stiff, almost statuesque, but his head was slightly tilted, observing, like someone examining a photograph. Elaine blinked, and he was gone. She didn't scream. She didn't even tell Peter that night. She simply began sleeping with the hallway light on, as if that faint amber glow might keep the figure at bay. But both of them knew. He was still there, pacing his study, watching his grounds, rehearsing lines for a performance no one would ever see again. And the house, that house in the hills, held onto his presence with a grip neither time nor new ownership could loosen. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. By the time summer deepened, the house seemed to shift its very temperament. The air, always cool from the marine layer that rolled over the hills at night, became oppressively still inside. Even when the windows were left open, no breeze passed through, as though the air itself refused to disturb the lingering energy coiled in the walls. Peter began sleeping later and later. He'd sit up on the couch in the living room, staring at the muted glow of the fireplace even when no fire burned. The house creaked constantly, wood expanding and contracting, but it sounded less like the casual settling of an old home and more like movement. Floorboards strained under weight that shouldn't have been there. He became increasingly obsessed with that sound, listening for patterns, trying to discern where the steps went when he wasn't watching. He stopped drinking not out of discipline, but because he wanted to remain alert. He'd begun hearing the murmurs again, never clear, always slurred like someone talking in his sleep. One night, just past 3 a.m., Peter rose suddenly, pulled by a sound he couldn't ignore, a distinct tap-tap-tap of knuckles against wood. It was coming from the study. He stood at the threshold, not daring to cross into the room. The desk was just barely illuminated by moonlight filtering through the window, and in that muted glow, he saw the chair, the same leather chair they'd never moved, slightly rocking, as if someone had just stood up from it. Peter waited, frozen, watching the subtle sway of the chair. Then, from the darkness of the far corner of the room, a voice clearer than ever before rasped, "I never finished. I never finished." The voice was tired, strained, a performer reciting to an audience that wasn't there. Peter stumbled backward, his heart racing so violently he thought it might crack his ribs. The hallway seemed longer now, stretching endlessly behind him, and he could feel it, the presence watching him from the darkness, amused, perhaps even frustrated. He fled to the bedroom, locked the door, and sat against it like a child warding off a nightmare. Elaine stirred but didn't wake fully. She was already slipping into the strange, heavy sleep that had overtaken her most nights, a sleep filled with dreams she couldn't recall, but always left her exhausted and cold when morning came. Days later, while Peter was organizing boxes in the garage, he found an old folder tucked behind a loose panel. Inside were black and white photographs, clearly from decades ago. They were candid shots of the house, the garden, the study, and several of them showed a man standing at various points around the property. He was always alone, smoking, his expression fixed in a strange vacancy. One photograph in particular made Peter's breath catch. The man stood by the garden gate, staring directly at the camera, his features blurred slightly, but unmistakably similar to the figure Elaine had described weeks before. In the margins of the photograph, written in faint pencil, was a single line: "They only remember me when I'm gone." Peter didn't show the pictures to Elaine. He stuffed the folder back between the boxes, but the images remained burned in his mind. Elaine, weakened by her illness, started spending more time in the garden during the late afternoons. Even though the air there felt heavier, as if the eucalyptus branches sagged not from age, but under the weight of observation. Sometimes she'd sit and feel eyes on her, watching from the house. On 2 occasions, she caught sight of the curtains in the study window gently parting, though no one was inside. One afternoon, as the sky bruised into dusk, she heard humming from the house, low, familiar, almost tender. A man's voice, carrying a melody she swore she knew but couldn't place. It faded as the wind finally picked up, rustling the leaves into a slow applause. That night, she told Peter. He said nothing, but before they both slept, she whispered, "I don't think he wants us to leave." Peter looked at her, the dark of the room making her face seem hollow, unfamiliar. "I don't think we can," he answered softly. And yet, neither of them said the word ghost. To name it would have made it real, something neither of them could undo. But both knew that deep inside the house, within the walls of the study, under the creaking floorboards, and in the thin, stale air, something of David Janssen still paced, still smoking, still memorizing lines for a performance that never ended. And the house? It remembered. It always did. By the end of that year, the house had taken on a perpetual twilight, even during daylight. The heavy cypress and eucalyptus surrounding the villa blotted out the sun in strange ways, casting a grayish-green filter over everything inside. Dust seemed to settle faster, no matter how much they cleaned. The air felt drier. Elaine became weaker. She no longer ventured into the garden, and her sleep turned thin and restless, punctuated by half-formed mutterings she didn't remember upon waking. She'd started to mumble in her sleep phrases that didn't sound like her own voice, but Peter could never be sure. Peter, too, had changed. His face grew hollow, eyes bruised with insomnia, skin pallid and thin like crumpled paper. He stopped, leaving the property altogether. His studio equipment gathered dust. Most days he just sat in the living room, staring at the hallway that led to the study, waiting for the footsteps. And they came every night, unwavering, that slow, thoughtful pacing back and forth, always ending with the gentle creak of the study chair being pulled back, then pushed in, then pulled back again. Eventually, Elaine stopped getting up altogether. She barely ate, barely spoke. One night, she whispered, "He rehearses for me now. I think he's lonely." Peter asked her what she meant, but she simply smiled a sad, distant smile and turned away, falling into another murky sleep. That was the last thing she ever said to him. She died quietly in her sleep, sometime in late October. The coroner said her condition had worsened unexpectedly, but there was no sign of distress, no struggle. It was as if she simply gave in. Peter didn't cry. He sat with her body for hours, just listening to the sounds of the house. He didn't call anyone. It was nearly dawn before he stood, walked slowly down the hall, and opened the door to the study. The smell of cigarette smoke hit him like a wall. But beyond that, there was something thicker in the air, a sense of pressure, of anticipation, like the air was waiting to collapse inward. He saw the chair turned away from the desk, facing the window that overlooked the garden. And though the room was empty, Peter felt someone was seated there. He felt it like the heat from a living body, an invisible weight in the room. He stepped closer, his bare feet cold against the tiled floor. Without knowing why, he said aloud, "I'm ready." No voice answered him, but the room seemed to exhale a soft, low hum beneath the walls, as if acknowledging his words. Peter sat in the chair. He rested his head against the back, eyes half closed, as the first pale light of morning stained the sky outside, and the house fell quiet. No footsteps that night, no murmurs, no music. Peter's body was found days later by a realtor sent to check on them. After repeated unanswered calls, the authorities said it was natural causes: exhaustion, dehydration, grief. They never explained why both he and Elaine seemed so severely emaciated, or why the temperature inside the house was several degrees colder than outside. The house sat vacant for over a year. No one wanted to touch it, though the land alone was worth a small fortune. Eventually, it was bought quietly by a private developer, intending to renovate it into a modern retreat. But construction never finished. Workers complained of tools going missing, strange voices when they worked late, a shadow they'd catch in their periphery of a man pacing back and forth in the gutted study, smoking a cigarette that never burned out. One night, the foreman, a skeptical man by nature, stayed late to take inventory. Alone in the shell of the house, he wandered into the partially restored study. There, in the dust on the floorboards, were footprints, pacing from wall to window, over and over, pressed deeply into the grime as though someone walked that path for decades. At the center of the room, resting on a wooden beam, lay a crushed cigarette, but fresh, still fragrant. No one on site smoked. The crew refused to return. The house was boarded up again, the project abandoned. It still stands, swallowed by trees and ivy, hidden from the road. A heavy silence lingers around it, a kind of waiting. Locals say sometimes you can hear it if you park nearby with your engine off, a faint shuffle of footsteps, a low voice murmuring a monologue to an unseen crowd, and the occasional curl of cigarette smoke drifting from an upper window that should have been sealed shut years ago. They say David Janssen never left, and neither did the others. On colder nights, when the marine fog rolls heavy through the canyons, some say you can see a single light flicker in the study window, pale, orange, like the ember of a cigarette, glowing and fading, glowing and fading. It's never steady, always pulsing gently, as though someone sits just beyond the glass, taking slow, measured drags. A few hikers, those who've taken the wrong trail near the back of the property, Report hearing snippets of dialogue carried on the wind-fractured lines, rehearsals of some forgotten script. Phrases like, "Let's run it again. I'll get it this time." They're still watching, aren't they? No one has stayed long enough to see the speaker, but all claim they felt watched not by a living soul, but by something entrenched, something that remembers its lines but not the audience it's meant for. The house itself is barely visible now, choked by wild growth, trees pressing in, as if the land is trying to swallow it whole. But nothing ever quite covers it entirely. It remains patient, expectant as if the walls themselves are holding their breath, waiting for another occupant, another audience to fill the empty rooms. Some locals claim that as long as the house stands, the performance inside will never end. And deep inside, in the heart of the house, in that shadowed study, the footsteps still walk, the chair still creaks, the cigarette still burns, and David Janssen still rehearses. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.